I still remember every detail of that Tuesday evening in downtown Chicago. The rain was hitting the windows of Murphy's Steakhouse with that rhythmic pattern that usually calms me. But that night, nothing could ease the knot in my stomach. I was 26 years old, working as a junior marketing coordinator at a mid-size advertising firm, and desperately trying to prove I belonged at that table. The company's quarterly dinner was supposed to be a celebration. Our biggest client, Henderson Tech, had just signed a 3-year contract extension worth millions. Everyone was there, the senior partners, account directors, and a handful of us junior staff who'd worked behind the scenes to make it happen. I'd spent months crafting presentations, analyzing market data, and staying late to perfect every detail of the Henderson campaign. Marcus Sullivan, our senior account director, was holding court at the head of the table. He was everything I thought I wanted to be: confident, well-dressed, commanding respect from everyone around him. His laugh was loud and infectious, and when he spoke, people listened. I'd always admired him from afar, thinking maybe one day I could be like him. The conversation had turned to the upcoming Henderson Tech launch campaign. Someone mentioned the demographic analysis that had been crucial to winning the client over. I felt a surge of pride. That was my work. Months of research, late nights, and countless revisions had gone into that analysis. This was my moment. I cleared my throat and leaned forward slightly. Actually, I'm really excited about that demographic breakdown. The data showed some fascinating patterns in the 25 to 34 age group that completely changed our approach to the social media strategy. The table went quiet for a moment. I could feel my heart racing, but I pressed on. The insight about their mobile usage patterns during lunch hours was what really convinced Henderson Tech that we understood their target market better than their previous agency. Marcus turned to look at me, and for a split second I thought I saw approval in his eyes. Then his expression changed. A slow, condescending smile spread across his face, and he let out a chuckle that made my blood run cold. "Oh, that's cute," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "You think you contributed something meaningful to this campaign?" He looked around the table, making sure everyone was listening. "Listen, kid, running a few Google searches and putting together some PowerPoint slides doesn't make you a strategist." I felt my face burning. But I spent weeks analyzing the data, cross-referencing multiple sources, and identifying patterns that... Stop! Marcus held up his hand, and the authority in his voice silenced me instantly. "You're nothing more than a glorified intern who happened to be in the room when real professionals were working. The demographic analysis? That was standard market research that any first-year business student could have compiled." The words hit me like a physical blow. I looked around the table, hoping someone would defend me, but everyone was staring at their plates or suddenly finding their wine glasses fascinating. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Marcus wasn't finished. "You want to know what your real contribution was? You were the coffee runner, the note taker, the guy who made sure the printer had enough paper." He leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying himself. "And that's probably all you'll ever be in this industry." I sat there frozen, feeling smaller and more insignificant than I'd ever felt in my life. The restaurant's ambient noise, the clinking of silverware, the murmur of other conversations, the soft jazz playing in the background, all seemed to fade away until all I could hear was the sound of my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. "You're nothing," Marcus said quietly, but loud enough for everyone to hear. "And the sooner you accept that, the better off you'll be." I don't remember much about the rest of that dinner. I think I mumbled some excuse about feeling sick and left early. I walked through the Chicago streets in the rain, my suit getting soaked, my confidence shattered. 26 years old, and I felt like my entire future had just been decided by someone else's cruel words. The weeks following that dinner were the darkest of my professional life. I went through the motions at work, keeping my head down, avoiding eye contact with Marcus and the others who had witnessed my humiliation. Every morning, I'd wake up hearing his words, "You're nothing." Every night, I'd lie in bed replaying the scene, thinking of all the things I should have said. My performance at work began to suffer. I was distracted, unmotivated, and increasingly bitter. My supervisor, Janet, noticed the change but attributed it to stress from the big client win. She had no idea that I was slowly dying inside, questioning everything I thought I knew about my abilities and my future. It was on a Friday evening, 3 weeks after the dinner, that everything changed. I was staying late again, not because I was particularly motivated, but because going home meant being alone with my thoughts. I was mindlessly scrolling through industry newsletters when I came across an article about a small startup called Technova that had just landed a major contract with a Fortune 500 company. What caught my attention wasn't the success story itself, but a quote from Technova's founder, Sarah Chen. She said, "The biggest mistake companies make is dismissing ideas based on who presents them, rather than evaluating the merit of the ideas themselves. Some of our best innovations have come from our youngest team members who see things differently." That quote hit me like lightning. I realized that Marcus had done exactly what Sarah Chen was talking about. He dismissed my work not because it was bad, but because of who I was. A junior employee who didn't fit his image of what a real strategist looked like. For the first time in weeks, I felt something other than defeat. I felt anger. But it wasn't the destructive kind of anger that tears you down. It was the kind that builds you up, that fuels determination. I started researching Sarah Chen and Technova. What I discovered was fascinating. She had started the company after being overlooked for promotion at 3 different tech firms. Instead of accepting that verdict, she'd taken her ideas and built something remarkable. Technova specialized in demographic analysis and consumer behavior prediction. Exactly the kind of work I'd been doing for Henderson Tech. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to prove Marcus wrong, not by arguing with him or trying to change his mind, but by becoming so undeniably successful that his words would look foolish in retrospect. I began working on my own demographic analysis project during my lunch breaks and evenings. I chose a local restaurant chain that was struggling to attract younger customers. Using publicly available data and some creative research techniques I'd learned in college, I started building a comprehensive profile of their target demographic. The work was challenging, but for the first time since that horrible dinner, I felt alive. I was doing something I was passionate about, something I was good at, and something that mattered. I reached out to the restaurant's marketing manager and offered to present my findings for free as a way to build my portfolio. The presentation went better than I could have hoped. The marketing manager was impressed with the depth of my analysis and the actionable insights I'd provided. They implemented several of my recommendations and saw immediate results. A 15% increase in customers aged 25 to 35 within the first month. Word began to spread in Chicago's marketing community about the young analyst who had helped turn around Romano's Italian kitchen. I started getting calls from other small businesses wanting similar help. I was building a reputation, one client at a time. As my freelance work began to grow, I faced new challenges. Balancing my day job with my evening and weekend consulting was exhausting. I was working 12-hour days regularly, surviving on coffee and determination. My social life disappeared entirely, and I began to question whether I was pushing myself too hard. The first major obstacle came when I landed a potential client that could change everything. A mid-sized tech company called Innovate Solutions. They wanted a comprehensive demographic and market analysis for a new product launch. The contract was worth more than I made in 3 months at my day job, but it required me to compete against established consulting firms. I remember sitting in my tiny studio apartment in Lincoln Park, surrounded by market research reports and empty coffee cups, wondering if I was in over my head. This wasn't just about proving Marcus wrong anymore. This was about proving to myself that I could compete at a higher level. The presentation for Innovate Solutions was scheduled for a Thursday morning. I had prepared for weeks, but 2 days before the presentation, disaster struck. My laptop crashed, taking with it weeks of work. I was missing crucial data and had less than 48 hours to recreate everything. This was when I learned the true value of the relationships I'd been building. Maria Santos, the marketing manager from Romano's Italian Kitchen, immediately offered to let me use her office after hours. "You helped us when we needed it," she said. "Now it's our turn to help you." I worked for 36 hours straight, rebuilding my presentation from scratch. But something remarkable happened. The new version was better than the original. The pressure had forced me to think more creatively and present my insights more clearly. The presentation at Innovate Solutions went exceptionally well. I could see the surprise on the faces of the executives when this young, relatively unknown consultant walked in with insights that were more thorough and creative than what the established firms had presented. A week later, I got the call. I had won the contract, but the real validation came from an unexpected source. Janet, my supervisor at the advertising firm, called me into her office. She'd noticed that I'd been using vacation days frequently, and she was concerned. "I've been watching you for the past couple of months," she said. "Your work here has been adequate, but I can tell your heart isn't in it. Is there something going on that I should know about?" I took a deep breath and decided to be honest. I told her about the dinner with Marcus, about how his words had affected me, and about the freelance work I'd been doing to rebuild my confidence and prove my abilities. Janet listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "I had no idea Marcus had said those things to you," she finally said. "That was completely inappropriate and unprofessional. But I have to say, I'm impressed with how you've responded. The freelance work you're describing sounds more sophisticated than what we typically see from consultants with years more experience." She leaned forward. "I want to offer you something. We've been considering creating a new position, a senior demographic analyst role that would involve working directly with our biggest clients. The salary would be a significant increase, and you'd have the autonomy to develop your own methodologies. Would you be interested?" I was stunned. 6 months earlier, I'd been dismissed as a glorified intern. Now I was being offered a senior position based on work I'd done on my own time. The company's next quarterly dinner was scheduled for a Tuesday evening in November. This time, it was being held at the Signature Room on the 95th floor of the John Hancock Building, with spectacular views of Chicago's skyline. I'd been invited as one of the senior staff members, a recognition that would have seemed impossible just 6 months earlier. As I rode the elevator up to the 95th floor, I thought about how much had changed. I was wearing a new suit, not because I was trying to impress anyone, but because I felt confident and successful. I'd closed 3 major consulting contracts in the past month, and my work at the advertising firm had earned recognition from clients and colleagues alike. When I walked into the restaurant, I spotted Marcus immediately. He was at the bar, holding court with a group of junior staff members, telling some story that had them all laughing. He looked exactly the same, confident, well-dressed, commanding attention. But somehow he seemed smaller to me now. Janet introduced me to several new clients as our senior demographic analyst who's been instrumental in our recent successes. I shook hands, made small talk, and genuinely enjoyed the networking opportunities. This was a far cry from the nervous, eager-to-please junior employee who had attended the last dinner. As we sat down for dinner, I found myself at the same table as Marcus. He nodded at me politely, but I could see the confusion in his eyes. He clearly remembered our last interaction, but he wasn't sure how to reconcile that memory with my current position. The conversation inevitably turned to our recent client successes. Someone mentioned the Innovate Solutions contract, which had been one of the biggest wins of the quarter. "That demographic analysis was incredible," said Rebecca, one of the account managers. "I've never seen market research that detailed and actionable. It completely changed how we approach tech sector clients." Marcus perked up. "Oh, who handled that analysis?" "I don't think I was involved in that project." "Actually," Janet said, looking at me with a smile, "that was all our senior analyst here. He led the entire demographic research and strategic planning phase." Marcus's expression shifted as he processed this information. He looked at me, then back at Janet, clearly trying to understand how the person he'd dismissed as nothing had become responsible for one of the company's biggest successes. This was my moment. 6 months earlier, I would have been defensive or angry. I would have wanted to throw his words back at him, to make him feel as small as he had made me feel. But I'd learned something important during those months of building my reputation and proving myself. Success speaks louder than anger. "I've been fortunate to work on some really exciting projects lately," I said calmly. "The Innovate Solutions analysis was particularly interesting because it required some unconventional research approaches. We had to look beyond traditional demographic categories and really understand the behavioral patterns driving their target market." I went on to describe some of the insights I'd uncovered, the methodologies I'd developed, and the results we'd achieved. I wasn't bragging or trying to show off. I was simply sharing my work with the same passion and expertise that had driven me to succeed. As I spoke, I noticed the table had gone quiet. Everyone was listening intently, asking thoughtful questions about my approach and my findings. Even Marcus was leaning forward, clearly interested despite himself. "That's fascinating," said Tom, one of the senior partners. "The predictive modeling you're describing, is that something you developed yourself?" "Mostly yes," I replied. "I combined some established statistical techniques with some newer approaches I'd been researching. The key was recognizing that traditional demographic categories weren't capturing the behavioral nuances we needed to understand." Rebecca turned to Marcus. "You know, this is exactly the kind of strategic thinking we need more of in the Henderson Tech account. Marcus, you should definitely bring him into some of those high-level planning sessions." The irony wasn't lost on anyone at the table. 6 months earlier, Marcus had publicly humiliated me over my contribution to the Henderson Tech campaign. Now colleagues were suggesting that my expertise was exactly what that same campaign needed. Marcus cleared his throat. "Yes, that sounds like a good idea. We should definitely explore that." As the evening progressed, something remarkable happened. People began approaching me with questions about their own projects, asking for my insights and advice. I found myself in the center of conversations about strategy and innovation, being treated as an expert rather than a junior employee trying to prove himself. But the most meaningful moment came near the end of the evening. Marcus approached me as I was getting ready to leave. "Can I speak with you for a moment?" he asked. We stepped away from the crowd near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Chicago's twinkling lights. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "What I said at that dinner 6 months ago was wrong. It was unprofessional and it was cruel. I had no right to dismiss your contributions or to make you feel small." I looked at him, this man who had seemed so powerful and intimidating just months earlier. He looked genuinely remorseful, and I realized that my anger toward him had long since faded. "I appreciate that," I said, "but honestly, in a strange way, I'm grateful for what happened. It forced me to prove to myself what I was capable of. It pushed me to work harder and think more creatively than I ever had before." Marcus nodded. "Your work speaks for itself now. I was wrong about you, and I'm glad you proved me wrong." As I rode the elevator down from the 95th floor that night, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. 6 months earlier, I had left a restaurant feeling defeated and worthless. Tonight, I was leaving as a respected professional who had earned his place at the table through hard work, creativity, and determination. The view from the Hancock building was spectacular, but it paled in comparison to the view of my future that stretched out before me. I had learned that sometimes the harshest criticism can become the greatest motivation, and that the opinion of others matters far less than the work you're willing to do to prove yourself. Marcus had been wrong about me, but more importantly, I had been wrong about what I needed from him or anyone else. I didn't need their approval or recognition to be successful. I just needed to believe in myself and be willing to do the work. As I walked through the Chicago streets that night, the same streets where I'd walked in defeat 6 months earlier, I smiled. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new projects, and new opportunities to grow. But tonight, I was simply grateful for the journey that had brought me here. The kid who had been dismissed as nothing had become someone who left everyone speechless. And that was just the beginning.